In the spring of 1960, my father was a student at East Texas Baptist College in Marshall, Texas. He wrote to his fiancée, my mother, every day, and on this day, he was trying to get to the post office so that he could get his letter in the mail before they closed.
Must have been about 4:30 in the afternoon. All the roads to the courthouse were blocked off, and I needed to cross the courthouse to get to the post office on the other side. An officer of some sort ran up to me and tried to stop me from crossing the square. He called my attention to the large number of black people that were gathered near the courthouse in some type of protest. I insisted about mailing my letter, so he let me go, but he directed me and to stay on the other side. As I came out of the post office, I started back across the courthouse square in defiance of what the officer had told me to do, and I saw firemen take out fire hoses and spray the students and protesters back to the side of the square where they had come from. The water knocked one boy backwards about 3 feet in the air. After mailing my letter, I stood near some other white people on the corner, and they told me that a bunch of the colored kids had been arrested for protesting earlier, and they were in the courthouse. I stood there and watched as the kids were released from the courthouse one at a time, and they had to walk in single file from the courthouse. Some of the white people near me hollered things that were disrespectful, but most of them just stood and watched. I felt uncomfortable standing there, so I crossed to the other side of the square and stood near some of the black folk.
This was an important part of my dad's story. He emphasized the symbolism in the act of moving from one side of the square to the other. When my father returned to his dorm, several of his classmates were discussing all the things that had happened downtown that day. He learned that the students that he saw were from the local black colleges, Wiley and Bishop, and some had come from Texas Southern. They were preparing for sit-in demonstrations at lunch counters the next day.
One of the guys who lived with me in the dorm at the college saw me later and said, "We saw you standing over there with those niggers. What was that about?" I just confirmed it, and he didn't say anything else. I told him I was going down to watch the sit-ins at the Woolworth, which was scheduled for the next day, but nobody else wanted to go with me. So I thought I wanted to witness history in the making, but the next day I ended up going down there by myself.
Dad learned some things about his fellow students that day.
I knew about a back door to the Woolworths that was very seldom used by anybody else, so I drove downtown and parked where I could access that door. Surprisingly, there wasn't anybody going in on that side. I didn't really see anything going on, but I just stood kind of out of sight behind the display area. I could see the soda fountain from where I was standing, and nothing was happening, but there were signs on the counter that said closed. Around noon, 6 or 7 of the black students came in and sat down on the stools at the counter. When they got all set and seated, the police came in and said rather nicely to them, "This counter is closed and we're asking you to leave." Then some other officers, short time later, troopers, came in and more forcefully said, "Get up or else you'll be arrested." One of the students just sat there, and the cop said, "Didn't you hear me?" He didn't react, and the policeman picked him up by the collar of his shirt and jerked him around, and the kid stumbled and kind of fell to the ground. At that time, I saw the policeman raising a billy club, and that's when I turned out and left as soon as I could.
At this point in his story, my father stopped talking for a few seconds. His voice had cracked at the end of the last sentence, and I knew he was fighting back tears. Dad learned some things about himself that day, too. This man, who wanted to see history in the making, couldn't bear to see it after all.
I might do it differently today, but then I just didn't want to see somebody actually getting beat up or hit with that billy club or something, so I just didn't want to see what was going to happen next, so I just snuck out the back door. In the town, no one talked about it much, or at the college. The community people just didn't talk about it. It was just kind of like it didn't even happen. That was surprising to me.
When I heard this story nearly 50 years after it happened, I learned some things about my dad. I also gained insight about our world today. Stories like Dad's are powerful and worth telling again and again. They teach us about justice, and they teach us about humanity.